This is Dr. Dennis Bielfeldt of the Christ School of Theology. We were talking last time about the results of the first critique of Immanuel Kant. The results are largely negative for theology. The critique of pure reason suggests that all of nature is deterministic and claims, of course, presupposes that we cannot know if anything ultimately important or meaningful exists. All we can know are the empirical concepts of the understanding. Those are the objects of the world and how they're related causally and to their substantiality and their causal relationships. While human beings can employ reason, right, they can only do it regulatively. They can dream metaphysical castles, but after all, this is just the way the human being works, the human mind works. We can't assert that what is so for thinking must be so of the world. Right? Reason must keep in its own province, purely regulatively. It's a way what human beings think, but it is not a way that human beings discover what ultimately is. Human reason cannot establish that there is a God, that there is immortality, or that there is any freedom. And in fact, it can't even think the substantiality of God. As something that actually exists. You can think of God as this kind of being, but there's no reason to believe that there is anything in the noumenal world like this thing we are thinking metaphysically. And the results of all this seem largely negative for theology. But what Kant takes away with his left hand, the goat hand, right, critique of pure reason, he's going to now give with his sheep hand, right, the critique of practical reason, or at least one might argue this. What Kant takes away in the first critique is, God, immortality, and freedom. But he tries to restore these things in the second and third critique, but in another key. The critique of practical reason argues that human beings nominally, not phenomenally, but nominally are confronted with duty. And Kant argues that on the basis of this duty, human beings are practically free, kind of from the inside, even though empirically determined, if you look at this from the outside and take an external view of things. See? Now this is a hard thing to grasp at first. If we look at ourselves scientifically and we study ourselves, our empirical egos, if you will, we're going to see that they are substances that fall under certain causal laws, right? But if we're on the inside of ourselves, in the so-called first-person account, right, we have a direct experience of duty. And for Kant, this takes us now into the noumenal itself. Okay, there are many reasons for why this takes us into the noumenal itself, and some will not be persuaded by these, but this is basically what Kant argues. And he argues then that ethics is connected to the noumenal, and he tries to derive ethics purely formally, without recourse to any empirical content, which is phenomenal. He has a notion of the categorical imperative. The categorical imperative is that ethical principle that holds because it would be contradictory were it not to hold. Okay, so you got to hold on to that. And there are two subjective maxims of the categorical imperative, and here they are. Subjective maxim number one: so act such that in your act could become a universal law, right? And number two: so act such that in your act you treat the other as an ends in themselves and not as a means. These are the two great maxims of the categorical imperative. Now, Kant has then argued in the first critique that human beings actively organize the empirical order. Did you catch that? We're actively organizing the empirical order. Thus, the laws of nature are that which come from us. The laws of nature, Thus, the law of human beings is what governs things. I mean, there can be no more modern expression of autonomy. You know, Kant loved Rousseau, right? It's great stuff. Now, Kant argues in the second critique that human beings are their own moral lawgiver, right? By acting in accordance with the categorical imperative, human beings determine what is right and wrong and good and bad. And I don't want anyone here to think that, although Kant talks about God in the critique of practical reason, that God is a primary notion. God is a postulate of practical reason. Human beings are the lawgivers, right? Kant postulates that because human beings are confronted by duty, they must be free to do that duty, even though they are empirically determined, they are practically free, right? Thou ought implies thou can, right? Very famous postulate. And so he gives freedom back here at the practical level, even though he's taken it away from the standpoint of the critique of pure reason. Kant then goes on in the second postulate to claim that while, of course, there is no theoretical grounds for belief in the immortality of the soul, we are allowed to postulate it because there is not enough time in this life for human beings to do their duty. So because there's not enough time here to do our duty, we are entitled to believe that the soul survives death in order to do duty. Even though we can find no sound argument for the immortality of the soul, our moral experience allows us to believe in it. All right? So now we've gotten back with the right hand, the immortality of the soul, what Kant's taken away with the left hand. And here's the biggie. Kant, of course, takes away God with the left hand. There's no substantival being, God, having any causal relationship with the universe. But Kant postulates because our duty doing does not necessarily bring happiness. Why would we expect our duty doing to bring happiness anyway? We are entitled to believe in a God who rewards our duty doing with happiness. Even though we find no sound argument for the existence of God, our moral experience allows us to believe in it. So now he's given us God now back from the standpoint of practical reason. We can act as if there is freedom, act as if there is immortality, and act as if there is God, even though from the standpoint of the first critique, there is no place in the universe for there to be freedom, because everything is deterministic. And of course, there is no immortality, because there is no transcendental ego. I didn't get into that, but it's a part of the argument of the first critique. And finally, the third critique, from the standpoint of practical reason, there is no, we can talk about there being God to allow the kingdom of happiness to be brought into line with the kingdom of duty. We can believe there is a God even though there is no metaphysical way from the standpoint of the critique of pure reason to claim that there is a substance God causally related to the universe. I'm Dr. Dennis Bielfeldt of the Christ School of Theology at the Institute of Lutheran Theology. I'll be back soon. Thank you very much.